The sky didn't just turn black, it vomited a ceiling of rolling, superheated glass that turned high noon into the devil's midnight within seconds. I choked on the air, a thick, abrasive soup of pulverized rock and sulfur that coated my throat like wet cement, instantly regretting the moment I scrambled out of my patrol truck. My National Park Service uniform, usually a crisp olive-green symbol of authority and preservation, was now a heavy, suffocating suit of armor caked in gray sludge, the fabric straining across my shoulders as I heaved for breath. "Ranger down! I repeat, Ranger down at Old Faithful!" I screamed into the radio mic clipped to my shoulder, but the only response was the deafening static of the atmosphere tearing itself apart. Visibility was reduced to 3 feet of swirling particulate matter, lit only by the strobe light flashes of volcanic lightning arcing through the plume above. I wiped a layer of gritty slime from my eyes, my tactical gloves scraping against the raw skin of my face, and that's when the first shape lunged from the smoke. It wasn't a bear or a bison. It was a man, his skin blistered and sloughing off like wet paper, fused to the melted remnants of a neon windbreaker. He hit me with the force of a freight train, knocking the wind out of me as we slammed into the ash-covered asphalt. I gritted my teeth, the veins in my neck bulging like steel cables against the tight collar of my shirt as I brought my forearms up to block his snapping jaws. The heat radiating off him was intense, smelling of cooked meat and ozone. My biceps trembled violently, lactic acid flooding my muscles as I fought to hold back the weight of the creature, sweat carving clean tracks through the ash on my forehead. He wasn't just mindless, he was driven by a feral, agonizing hunger that the eruption had somehow unlocked. With a roar of exertion that scraped my raw throat, I bucked my hips and shoved him back just enough to create space. My right hand instinctively dropped to the drop-leg holster on my thigh, fingers wrapping around the textured grip of my Sig Sauer P320. I didn't hesitate. The slide locked back with a metallic clack as I fired, the muzzle flash illuminating the horrific texture of his melting face for a split second before the round put him down. I scrambled to my feet, chest heaving, heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird, realizing that the silhouette I just dropped was only the first of dozens emerging from the gray wall of death. My lungs burned like I was inhaling crushed glass, every frantic breath dragging the heavy, sulfur-laden air into a chest that felt constricted by a terrifying vice.
The ash fell thicker now, a relentless gray snow coating the brim of my campaign hat and settling into the creases of my sweat-drenched uniform, turning the silver badge on my chest into a ghostly, soot-covered relic. I didn't have time to process the nightmare. The silhouettes in the smoke were closing the distance, their movements jerky and unnatural, limbs snapping with the sickening crunch of dry, calcified bone. My heavy-duty Danner boots skid on a slick mixture of black ice and hot sludge as I backpedaled, the sheer weight of my tactical belt digging into my hips as I fought to keep my footing on the treacherous ground. One of them, a figure clad in the melted remains of hiking gear, broke into a shambling sprint, its face a horrific topography of raw, exposed muscle and weeping blisters. I planted my feet, the quadriceps in my thighs screaming in protest, veins popping along my forearms like subterranean roots as I transitioned from the empty pistol to the Remington 870 police magnum slung across my back. The pump action racked with a mechanical clack-clack that usually commanded absolute authority, but here, in this volcanic hellscape, it just sounded desperate. The recoil slammed into my shoulder, a brutal, reassuring kick that sent a spray of double-aught buckshot into the creature's center mass, turning its torso into a fine mist of vaporized blood and glowing ash. The noise only drew more of them out of the gray void. My vision blurred, stinging sweat mixing with the grit to form a blinding paste that glued my eyelashes together. I swung the shotgun stock like a battering ram, the polymer connecting with the jaw of a flanker that tried to claw at my Kevlar vest, the impact vibrating violently at my skeletal structure and jarring my teeth. I was trained for search and rescue, for bear deterrence, for wildfire containment, not for holding the line against a damned. Adrenaline spiked my heart rate to a dangerous rhythm, thudding against my eardrums and drowning out the low-frequency rumble of the earth beneath us, but I forced my trembling hands to reload, one shell at a time, knowing the ranger station was my only hope for survival. The distinct flat hat of the National Park Service was gone, lost miles back in the chaos,
leaving my sweat-drenched hair to plaster against a forehead throbbing with a migraine so intense it blurred the burning horizon. My structural fire boots felt like lead weights dragging through drifts of hot radioactive fallout, while the heat from the supervolcano's glow cooked the skin beneath my flame-resistant Nomex patrol shirt. A shadow lunged from the sulphurous fog. A tourist, or what was left of one, their melted synthetic jacket fused directly into blackened necrotic flesh.
I pulled the trigger, but the shotgun clicked on an empty chamber. I had miscounted the shells in the panic. Survival instinct, honed by years of wilderness enforcement, hijacked my nervous system. My grip tightened on the steel barrel until the knuckles turned white, and the veins in my forearms bulged like pressurized hoses against my dirty skin. With a feral roar that shredded my ash-coated throat, I reversed the weapon and drove the solid walnut stock forward in a brutal muzzle thump maneuver. The impact crunched into the creature's nasal cavity with wet, sickening resistance, spraying black, coagulated blood across my golden badge and the tactical radio clipped to my chest. The thing collapsed, twitching in the eerie orange magmatic light that underlit the smoke, illuminating the floating particulate matter like sparks in a hellish forge. My lungs heaved, sucking in air that tasted like burning tires and copper, every breath a jagged struggle against the N95 mask that was rapidly clogging with debris. I racked the slide, finally chambering a fresh slug with shaking, blistered fingers, my eyes locking onto the silhouette of the ranger station, my sanctuary, or my tomb, looming ahead through the deadly haze. The air wasn't just hot, it was a physical weight, a suffocating blanket of pulverized rock and aerosolized glass that scoured my exposed neck raw above the collar of my sweat-drenched uniform. I forced my legs to piston forward, the heavy rubber soles of my Danner tactical boots crushing the brittle, carbonized remains of the forest floor with every agonizing step. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird, the adrenaline spiking so hard my vision tunneled into a vignette of high-contrast horror, focusing entirely on the three shambling figures blocking the ranger station stairs. They were covered in blisters the size of softballs, their skin sloughing off in wet sheets to reveal raw, steaming musculature underneath that glistened in the ember-choked twilight. I didn't hesitate. Federal training overrode the trembling in my hands as I squared my shoulders against the recoil pad. I planted my feet, the muscles in my thighs bunching tight as steel cables under my cargo pants, and squeezed the trigger. The Remington 870 roared, a thunderclap that briefly deafened me, sending a spread of double-aught buckshot tearing through the center mass of the lead creature, shredding its chest cavity in a spray of dark, viscous fluid that caught the volcanic glow like rubies suspended in the air. But the other two were on me instantly, moving with a jerky, unnatural speed that defied their injuries. I didn't have time to pump the action.
Dropping the shotgun to let it hang by its tactical sling, I ripped my Sig Sauer P220 from the retention holster on my hip, the friction burning my palm. A scorched hand clamped onto my forearm, the heat radiating through my Nomex sleeve, searing the skin beneath, and I screamed through gritted teeth, the veins in my neck bulging against the strap of my helmet like rigid cords. With a guttural heave that strained every tendon in my upper body, I whipped the heavy polymer pistol grip across the attacker's temple. Crack, shattering bone and breaking its hold just enough to shove the muzzle into its open, wailing mouth and double-tap the trigger. The slide of my P220 barely had time to cycle another round before the third creature collided with me, a mass of melting flesh and kinetic fury that tackled me into the molten asphalt. The impact knocked the wind out of me, my Kevlar vest absorbing the blow but doing nothing to stop the stars exploding in my vision as the back of my helmet cracked against the road. Straddling my chest, the thing shrieked, a sound like tearing metal, and lunged for my throat, its skin glowing with an internal bioluminescent orange heat that blistered the air between us. I dropped the pistol, unable to bring the muzzle to bear in the crush, and locked my gloved hands around its wrists, the leather of my palms smoking instantly against its scorched dermis. My triceps screamed, shaking violently under the strain as I fought to keep its snapping jaws inches from my face. I could feel the blood vessels in my temples throbbing against the skin, swollen to the bursting point, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. Every fiber of my defensive tactics training from Fletz screamed, create space, but the sheer weight of the infected civilian pinned my hips to the ground, the heat from its body radiating through my uniform like I was lying in a furnace. Sweat poured into my eyes, stinging and blinding, mixing with the ash that rained down like gray snow. I gritted my teeth so hard I thought they would shatter, roaring with exertion as I bucked my hips, disrupting its center of gravity just enough to free my right hand. I didn't fumble. Muscle memory guided my fingers to the hilt of the Ka-Bar fixed blade knife secured on my belt, drawing the carbon steel in a blur of desperate motion.
With a final guttural heave that felt like it tore a muscle in my shoulder, I drove the blade upward, sinking it deep under the creature's jawline and severing the brainstem with a sickening wet crunch. The thing went instantly limp, a heavy sack of hot meat collapsing onto me, leaking black, oily fluid that hissed as it pulled in the crevices of my ranger green fatigues.
I shoved the corpse aside, rolling onto my hands and knees, retching dryly as I gasped for oxygen in the sulfur-choked night, my trembling hands frantically checking the integrity of my gear before the next wave could find me. I scrambled upright, my boots finding purchase in the slurry of ash and arterial spray, the sheer weight of my duty belt threatening to drag me back down into the abyss. My lungs burned as if I were inhaling broken glass, each ragged breath forcing the veins in my neck to bulge against the stiff collar of my uniform, pulsating with a toxic mix of adrenaline and terror. Through the swirling, heavy particulate that looked like nuclear winter rendered in high fidelity, I saw them. 3 more shapes emerging from the orange haze, their movements jerky and unnatural, bones snapping audibly as they sprinted on broken limbs. I didn't hesitate. I slapped the retention hood on my holster, ripping the Sig Sauer P320 free, my grip tightening until my knuckles turned white under the black nitrile gloves. I locked my elbows, adopting a modified Weaver stance despite the trembling in my core, and the world narrowed down to the glowing green dots of my tritium sights. Crack, crack! The recoil jolted through my forearms, sending a hot brass casing spinning through the ember-lit air as the first 9mm hollow point blossomed in the lead runner's forehead, snapping its head back in a spray of dark, viscous fluid. The muzzle flash illuminated the grotesque texture of their melting skin for a split second, a nightmare captured in a strobe light, before I pivoted, sweat flying from my hair, to track the second target lunging for my throat. The second creature collided with my chest, the kinetic energy absorbing into my soft body armor with a dull, suffocating thud that rattled my ribs and forced a guttural roar from my throat as I fought to keep my footing in the shifting volcanic sludge. My boots skidded through the muck, quads burning with lactic acid, while the creature's charred, flaking fingers clawed frantically at the radio mic clipped to my shoulder, tearing the heavy ripstop fabric of my uniform. I could feel the carotid artery in my neck throbbing violently against the sweat-soaked collar, every beat a sledgehammer of panic and instinct as I jammed my gloved offhand under its jaw to keep those snapping, jagged teeth inches from my face. Reverting to close-quarters retention drills, I tucked the Sig Sauer tight against my hip, angling the slide away from its grasping limbs to prevent a malfunction, and squeezed the trigger twice in rapid succession, thump-thump, sending 9mm rounds tearing upward through its torso, shattering the sternum and spraying hot black ichor across my ballistic eyewear.
The creature went limp, dead weight dragging me down, but I shoved the corpse aside just as the third figure broke through the wall of falling ash, swinging a rusted camping hatchet with manic, undead strength. I didn't have time to reacquire a sight picture. I snapped my ASP baton open with a metallic shing that cut through the low-frequency roar of the eruption, the hardened steel shaft locking into place instantly. With a primal scream that corded the muscles in my neck and sent sweat flying from my brow, I sidestepped the clumsy swing and drove the baton down in a fluid, trained arc, the carbon steel tip crunching sickeningly into the attacker's temple, collapsing the skull like a wet paper lantern and dropping the threat into the gray drifts at my feet. My lungs were bellows stoking a furnace of pure exhaustion, every ragged inhalation dragging hot, glass-shard ash through the failing filter of my respirator until I felt like I was drowning in dry cement. I wiped a mixture of volcanic grit and black blood from my eyes, my hand trembling not from fear, but from the sheer metabolic cost of survival, the veins in my forearms bulging like steel cables against the ripstop fabric of my sleeve as I tightened my grip on the 6 Sauer. The iconic flat hat was long gone, and my gray and green uniform, usually a symbol of authority and conservation, was now just a layer of ruined armor, the heavy duty belt digging painfully into my bruised hips as I pivoted on the heel of my tactical boot to scan the haze. Before I could even verify the chamber, a shape erupted from the swirling gloom, a massive figure in a tattered I Love Yellowstone hoodie, its jaw unhinged and swinging loosely as it barreled toward me with the momentum of a freight train. There was no room to fire. I braced my core, screaming as the muscles in my neck corded tight and drove the steel toe of my boot directly into its kneecap with a sickening wet crunch that vibrated all the way up my spine. The creature buckled,
but didn't stop clawing, forcing me to piston my arm forward, smashing the heavy slide of the pistol across the bridge of its nose in a brutal muzzle strike that sprayed teeth and dark fluid across the glowing embers at our feet. I didn't wait for it to fall. Instinct took over, and I shoved the barrel into the soft tissue under its chin, the recoil from the point-blank shot nearly wrenching the weapon from my slick, blood-greased glove as the muzzle flash briefly illuminated the absolute hellscape surrounding me. The slide of my 6 Sauer locked back on an empty chamber, with a metallic clack that sounded like a thunderclap in the muffled, suffocating silence of the falling ash.
I didn't have the luxury of a tactile pause. My muscle memory overrode the screaming lactic acid flooding my trapezoids as I holstered the scorching hot pistol and whipped the Remington 870 Police Magnum from the single-point sling across my chest, the heavy Parkerized steel slamming against the ceramic plate in my carrier vest. My breath was coming in ragged, shallow hitches, white plumes of vapor mixing with the volcanic gray particulate that coated my eyelashes and clogged the mesh of my tactical mic. Visibility was dropping to 0, the air thick with burning sulfur and the scent of copper, but the orange glow of the distant caldera illuminated the silhouetted horrors emerging from the tree line. Another one lunged, a massive figure wearing the shredded remains of a high-end hiking shell, and I braced my stance, digging the Vibram soles of my boots into the sliding scree of the trail. The sheer weight of my gear, the duty belt loaded with mags, cuffs, and radio, felt like it was crushing my lumbar spine, but I channeled every ounce of hysterical strength into my upper body, racking the shotgun's slide with a violence that threatened to tear the skin off my palm. The roar of the 12-gauge was a physical blow, the muzzle flash lighting up the microscopic details of the creature's rotting face a split second before the buckshot turned its cranial structure into a mist of bone fragments and dark sludge. The recoil hammered into my bruised shoulder, driving a fresh spike of agony down my bicep, but I couldn't stop. A second infected ranger, his uniform hanging in ribbons from a bloated gray torso, tackled me from the blind side. We hit the dirt with a bone-jarring thud, the heat from the ground scorching through my ripstop trousers as I struggled to keep the shotgun between us, the veins in my neck bulging like thick ropes against the collar of my uniform. He was heavy, an unnatural, dense weight that felt like grappling with a corpse filled with wet sand, his teeth snapping inches from my jugular as slobber dripped onto my faceplate. I roared, a primal sound tearing from my throat, and abandoned the gun to drive my elbow into his temple, the impact shuddering through my ulnar nerve like an electric shock. I scrambled back, my fingers clawing into the hot ash for purchase, and as he tried to rise, I swung the shotgun like a baseball bat, the polymer stock connecting with his jaw in a grotesque explosion of cartilage and fluid that sprayed across the iconic National Park Service arrowhead patch on my shoulder, now stained unrecognizable by the filth of the end of the world.
My lungs seized, dragging in air that tasted like sulfur and copper, while the veins in my forearms throbbed against the taut skin, gorged with adrenaline and the sheer physical toll of bludgeoning a former colleague to death. I didn't have the luxury of mourning. The heat from the eruption was cooking me inside my own gear, sweat stinging my eyes and plastering the gray uniform shirt to my back as I racked the slide of the Remington 870 with a violent shuck clack. The action ground against the grit of volcanic ash, ejecting a smoking hull that sizzled the instant it hit the blood-soaked earth, and I forced my trembling fingers to feed 2 fresh shells into the magazine tube, the fine motor skills barely registering through the numbness in my hands. Through the swirling, ember-choked fog, 3 more shapes materialized, their movements jerky and spasmodic, the dim glow of the lava reflecting off the wet sheen of their exposed musculature. I snapped the shotgun to my shoulder, the buttstock digging into the deep bruise already forming there, and centered the brass bead sight on the lead runner, a tourist still wearing an I Love Yellowstone hoodie that was now shredded to reveal a cavity where his stomach used to be. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird, the sound deafening in my ears, but years of range training took over the panic. I exhaled, squeezed the trigger, and let the boom of the 12-gauge tear through the roar of the volcano. The buckshot hit with the force of a freight train, catching the runner mid-stride and folding him backward in a spray of dark arterial fluid that painted the ash drifts black. The recoil snapped my head back, neck muscles straining, but I pivoted instantly to the left, driving the barrel toward the second figure lunging through the haze.
I fired again, the muzzle flash illuminating the grotesque peeling skin of its face for a microsecond before the shot obliterated its upper torso, sending me stumbling backward over the rough terrain, my boots sliding in the sludge of ash and gore as I fought to stay upright in this living hell. The ash-slicked ground offered no purchase, and before I could cycle the bolt, the third horror tackled me with the kinetic force of a falling boulder, driving the air from my lungs in a spray of blood and grit. We slammed into the geothermal mud, the impact rattling my molars, and I felt the blistering heat of the ground sear through the heavy fabric of my National Park Service trousers. My shotgun was pinned uselessly beneath us, so I jammed my forearm against the creature's throat, watching the tendons in my wrist bulge and throb violently as I fought to keep its snapping obsidian black teeth inches from my jugular.
Sweat streamed down my forehead, stinging my eyes and mixing with the sulfurous fallout, while the creature's necrotic fingernails scrabbled against the ceramic plate of my ballistic vest, shredding the outer carrier with manic intensity. My biceps screamed under the strain, burning with lactic acid as I leveraged every ounce of my functional strength training to hold back the snapping jaw. Relying on pure muscle memory drilled at the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center, I abandoned the grapple with my right hand, my fingers clawing desperately at my hip until they found the textured polymer grip of my Sig Sauer P229. I ripped the service weapon from its retention holster, the movement agonizingly slow against the chaotic blur of the attack, and jammed the muzzle directly into the soft tissue beneath the infected's jaw. The slide cycled with a violent mechanical snap as I pulled the trigger, the muffled gunshot venting superheated gas and craniomatter into the swirling, ember-choked air above us. I shoved the limp, twitching carcass aside and scrambled to my knees, my chest heaving like a bellows, gasping for oxygen that tasted like copper and brimstone, while my trembling hands violently re-indexed the pistol, scanning the hellscape for the next threat. The echo of my gunshot hadn't even died before the ash wall ahead churned violently, vomiting forth 3 more of those scorched, sprinting abominations. I didn't hesitate, my movements snapping into the rigid, drill-hardened cadence of a federal officer under fire, instantly holstering the sidearm to unsling the Remington 870 police magnum from my back. My deltoid screamed in protest, veins roping like steel cables beneath the sweat-soaked fabric of my gray uniform shirt as I racked the slide, the gritty sound of ash in the receiver grating against my eardrums like sandpaper. I squared my stance, Vibram-soled boots digging for traction in the slick, hazardous layer of fallout, and unleashed a torrent of double-aught buckshot that vaporized the lead runner's torso in a bloom of high-contrast gore and particulate matter. The recoil hammered my bruised shoulder, but the adrenaline dump was so massive time seemed to dilate, allowing me to see every individual ember drifting past the superheated barrel as I pumped another shell into the chamber with a guttural roar of exertion. The second creature closed the distance before I could reacquire a sight picture, forcing me to reverse the weapon and drive the heavy polymer stock into its face with enough kinetic force to shatter its orbital bone.
Sweat blinded me, stinging like acid, my chest heaving violently against the constricting ceramic plates of my vest as I let the shotgun hang by its sling and ripped the Pulaski tool from my belt, the weighted steel head gleaming ominously in the orange glow of the eruption. I swung the specialized firefighting axe with primal, desperate strength, the blade burying itself deep into the creature's clavicle with a wet, sickening thud, my forearm muscles twitching uncontrollably as I wrenched the weapon free to face the remaining darkness. Black blood sprayed across my protective eyewear in a thick, viscous arc, obscuring the terrifying geometry of the burning forest as I violently wrenched the Pulaski free, the steel scraping against shattered bone with a sound that vibrated straight up my exhausted radius and ulna. I didn't have the luxury of a breath. My lungs were seizing, burning with the inhalation of jagged silica and sulfur, while sweat poured in rivets down my soot-stained face, stinging my eyes and matting the collar of my uniform to my neck. Another shadow detached itself from the wall of smoke, a charred, blistered nightmare moving with unnatural velocity, and I barely had time to brace my core before it collided with me, the impact driving the ceramic plates of my body armor into my bruised ribs like a sledgehammer. We hit the ground hard, sliding through a slurry of mud and volcanic ash, and I could feel the creature's jagged fingernails raking uselessly against the heavy-duty nylon of my tactical pants, seeking the flesh of my thigh. My heart hammered against my sternum, a frantic drumbeat of survival, vast ropes of vascularity bulging along my forearms as I jammed the handle of the Pulaski across the creature's throat to hold back its snapping jaws. The heat from the eruption was suffocating, rendering the air shimmering and distorted, illuminating the creature's milky, cataract-filled eyes with a hellish orange subsurface scattering that made them look like molten glass. With a guttural roar that tore at my vocal cords, I summoned the last reserves of my strength, my triceps screaming in agony, and shoved the creature backward enough to create a critical gap.
I scrambled to my feet, boots slipping on the treacherous terrain, and dropped the Pulaski to draw my sidearm, the textured grip of the Sig Sauer P220 biting into my palm as I cleared the holster in one fluid, desperate motion. My vision tunneled, the world narrowing down to the tritium front sight post dancing over the creature's center mass, and I squeezed the trigger, the muzzle flash erupting in slow motion to reveal a spray of high-velocity gore as 2 rounds of 45 ACP punched through its chest cavity, dropping it instantly into the rising tide of ash.
The slide of my P220 locked back on an empty chamber, the metal radiating heat into my blistered palm as the echo of the double tap was swallowed instantly by the tectonic groan of the earth splitting apart beneath us. I didn't have time to breathe. My thumb hit the magazine release, sending the empty box clattering onto the obsidian shards, and my trembling, ash-caked hand fumbled for the fresh mag on my belt, the muscle memory of 1,000 range drills fighting through the sheer terror paralyzing my nervous system. Sweat cut acidic rivets through the gray soot masking my face, dripping onto the ballistic nylon of my plate carrier, which felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds, crushing my bruised ribs with every ragged inhalation. Through the thick, swirling curtain of particulate matter, I saw them, a phalanx of silhouettes detaching from the pyroclastic gloom, their skin blistering and peeling in the ambient thermal radiation like burning paper. I slammed the fresh magazine home and racked the slide, the serrations biting into my skin. But the sheer number of them forced me to holster the sidearm and reclaim the Pulaski axe from the dirt, my biceps screaming in protest as the veins in my forearms bulged like pressurized hoses against the strain. One of the infected lunged from the haze, a mass of exposed muscle fiber and teeth, and I swung the heavy tool with a primal roar, the adze blade crunching through the creature's clavicle with a sickening, wet thud that vibrated all the way up to my shoulders. I wrenched the weapon free in a spray of dark, viscous fluid, pivoting on my heel to face the horde, knowing my stamina bar was flashing red and the only way out was through a corridor of flesh and fire. My vision narrowed to a tunnel of gore-slicked obsidian and blistering heat, the world shrinking down to the brutal mechanics of swing, impact, and recoil. I didn't feel the heat of the pyroclastic flow anymore. I only felt the agonizing fire in my deltoids as I ripped the Pulaski free from a shattered ribcage, the heavy steel head gleaming wetly in the strobe light flashes of lightning tearing through the ash cloud. A feral shriek to my left triggered a violently ingrained reflex, and I dropped the melee tool, my hand snapping to the holster on my thigh with a speed born of desperation, my grip crushing the polymer frame of the Sig Sauer P320. The creature, a former tourist now reduced to a flayed, sprinting anatomy chart, lunged, and I fired from retention, the muzzle flash illuminating the bulging veins in my forearms as the recoil impulse traveled up my exhausted arm like a hammer blow.
The rounds punched wet, devastating craters through the thing's sternum, dropping it into the slurry of mud and ash, but my lungs were failing, wheezing like broken bellows against the sulfur-thickened air that tasted of copper and hellfire. I stumbled back toward the reinforced steel door of the station's fallout annex, my boots slipping on the slick remains of the fallen, every muscle fiber in my legs twitching in revolt against the weight of my tactical gear. With a final guttural roar of effort, I slammed my shoulder against the heavy iron barrier, throwing the locking bolts just as the wave of infected bodies slammed against the outside like a tsunami of meat. The sound of their claws scrabbling against the metal faded into the dull, tectonic rumble of the earth rearranging itself beneath us, and I slid down the cold concrete wall, my chest heaving so violently I thought my ribs would snap. I looked down at my hands, still shaking uncontrollably, the ranger green of my uniform stained black with soot and crimson with blood, and watched through the slit of reinforced glass as a bruised purple dawn struggled to pierce the volcanic winter. The night was over, but the apocalypse had just begun.